What's going on, everyone? So today we've got a ton more results in. Yesterday we had 3 total planetary qualifiers to talk about, and today, or at least results, we've got 11 now total planetary qualifiers data to talk about. So 8 brand new planetary qualifiers have finished out. We have a bunch of new winners to talk about. We've got a bunch of new leaders in the top 8 to talk about, including a massive surge of Cunning Heroism aggro. That is the name of the game. And we'll talk about it in just a moment, because I'm sure a lot of you are going to be like, oh, it's there. And you'll know when we talk about it in just a moment. But a big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. And also, I have a TCG player link in the description down below if you guys want to pick up any cards there. Let's first dive into some of the winners. So if you look here on the left hand side, we've got all 11 winners of the planetary qualifiers. We've got Iden, CAD Bane, Quinlan Red, Quinlan Green, Kira Green, Boss Green, CAD Bane Red, and 2 Han Yellows and 2 Sabine Greens. I'll say this straight up, the meta is absolutely amazing right now. There is a very, very healthy amount of various different decks. If we were to go back in set 2 and kind of see what Bobo was capable of, or rather, what Bobo would be capable of in set 3, this could be completely different. We may not be seeing a lot of these, maybe not like ultimate best decks like Quinlan Green potentially, or CAD Bane Blue, or Iden Blue, or whatever. The kind of decks that are more one-ofs as frequently. We may not see that as frequently, and certainly not as a winner of a planetary qualifier. We just didn't see that in planetary qualifiers from set 2. Not to mention the spread of the meta was also not as wide. As you can see, there's a lot of one-ofs, and there's a lot of random like 2-ofs, 3-ofs of decks that are people's kind of favorite, that are pretty solid, that aren't really going to be competing when you have such a dominant threat such as Boba. So this change, at least in terms of competitive Star Wars Unlimited, is absolutely amazing to see. Now, in terms of top 3 showings, first up, Sabine Green. We talked about this yesterday. Sabine Green, there's probably a bunch of reasons. A, it's probably the easiest deck to pick up out of any deck here on the list. It's one of the cheaper options, Django Red, and what's called, I forget the name off the top of my head, Han Yellow. Or I was to say, I forget the deck that's actually cheaper, are both cheaper than Sabine Green on average. I didn't take a look in like Quinlan Red, but I believe that's also cheaper on average than Sabine Green. So that may be a contender, or it's just people think Sabine Green is going to give you the best shot. And to be honest, so far, I don't know, again, how many of the actual players are fielding Sabine Green and what that conversion rate looks like. But in terms of results, Sabine Green has been putting them up, right? And Sabine Green is the #1 most winning and most top 8ing list so far. And most often, Sabine Greens are the least variable. And when you talk about things like, well, it could be any deck really, like Palpatine Yellow, Anakin Blues, or Kira Greens, or Han Yellows, there's a lot more variation that happens. Sabine Green, that's usually basically the same deck every single time. Han Yellow coming in at #2. This is also not exactly super surprising. It's a deck that many people knew from set 2, often kind of crowned as the best deck from set 2, at least during the middling / later periods of set 2. I think a lot of people, well, changed their mind as we got to see the planetary qualifier meta, because you can't really ignore Boba, as that would be, at least in terms of stats, and at least my opinion, the best deck from set 2. But seeing Han Yellow here at #2 with 10 top 8 spots, as well as the second most winningest deck, well, that makes a lot of sense, right behind Sabine Green. But then here's where we get to talk about something a little bit more interesting. We've got Quinlan Red at #3. It's tied for a bunch of other decks as, well, with that 1 win for a planetary qualifier, but 10 top 8 spots. Now, again, similar to Sabine Green, there could be many reasons for this, but I mentioned Quinlan Red as one of those decks that is really solid and something to look out for in my previous video talking about the meta decks for the planetary qualifiers. But also, I mentioned this about Cunning Heroism. Cunning Heroism is just really, really strong, okay? And Plo Koon is a large part of that. Quinlan with Plo Koon is just absolutely nuts. Plo Koon comes down same turn Quinlan does, right? And most often, you're going to have at least one other unit. So Plo Koon's going to come down as a 6-powered ambusher. Add to the fact that, well, basically, in most scenarios, you're going to be hitting something that has the same or less cost than Plo Koon. Plo Koon comes down as a 6/6 ambusher that also pings something for 1 due to Quinlan. That is absolutely nuts because you could take out 7 HP leaders, for example, Jango Fett. But even you can take out things like Han Yellow just straight up with just a Plo Koon attack, which is absolutely amazing and extremely powerful. Not to mention the disruption that Heroism Cunning offers already, but Plo Koon was certainly a major buff in that aspect. You also get the Force Throw, Force synergies in general, and in some Quinlan Red decks you're playing now, there are 2 of them. Most often, they're just kind of going with the standard, just solid Rebel aggro curve, and then you get to play Quinlan with Plo Koon as well. And there are a lot of decks like this. We'll talk about more, but I want to just stay on this point about Cunning Heroism again. And I'm sure a lot of you are just waiting for me to talk about this if you already know the results. We have Sabine Yellow as one of the top 8ers, 2 Fennec Reds as some top 8ers, Tarkin Town specifically, and a Cassian Yellow, all of which are kind of running a very similar strategy for the most part. They are a tempo, Cunning Heroism, Rebel aggro deck, or they are leaning more into space. Usually Sabine Yellow and Cassian Yellow are a little bit more space focused, whereas Fennec Red and Quinlan Red are a little bit more ground focused. Now, I wish I could talk about the deck lists here, but unfortunately right now, if I just click on this, you'll see that there are no Fennec Red deck lists to talk about that are shown in the data right now for the planetary qualifiers. But it would be absolutely amazing to dive in and see if it was more space focused in this variation of the planetary qualifiers, or if it was the more ground based Plo Koon variants that we're seeing from Quinlan. Now, I know I still am not a massive fan of Fennec. I would still put her in like the B tier, as I said in my video for Fennec last time. I don't think she's like an excellent deck in terms of like compared to Sabine Green or Han Yellow. You could argue that she's like a more A tier, but I think this is more representative of Cunning Heroism. And I know people are going to disagree with me. Maybe people just enjoy playing Fennec, and we're seeing a lot of Fennec because we have, again, as I mentioned with that Fennec video, a lot of Fennec supporters and a lot of dedicated players to Fennec. But I do think this is just more representative of Cunning Heroism being ridiculous and being extremely strong in terms of what it was able to offer in set 3, and it's kind of not having to contend with Boba Fett, which is one of those things that was really, really tricky. Another thing that I wanted to mention after the Cunning Heroism, which we can talk about that forever, was the fact that Jango Red was seemingly really underperforming in the first couple of planetary qualifiers, which makes me again want to know the actual field, because as you can see here, we can see the top 8 field and all the bases associated with it and all that, but we don't get to see how many people are bringing like Sabine Greens and Jango Reds. But Jango Red was by far one of the most popular decks earlier on in set 3, and as of yesterday with 3 planetary qualifiers, I believe we saw 1 Jango Red and a lot of other decks above it, and then still pretty decent performance by all means. It is definitely a meta deck, but I think it was a little bit underperforming and still is for people that were rooting for Jango Red. We've got Bossk Blue and CAD Bane Red above it, or rather Bossk Blue tied with it. I think this is pretty standard. These 6 decks here, 5 of them I had in my video. The Quinlan Red one was one that I said to look out for at the end of the video, but I didn't offer a deck list. And so Quinlan Red out of all of these are definitely Quinlan in general, definitely the decks that are overperforming, at least in my opinion. Another deck that I wanted to mention that's a little bit more underperforming is Anakin Blue. We saw him put up a lot of results earlier on, but I do think this is a result of just a lot of different things for Anakin Blue to manage. If you are playing this more mid-range, value-oriented, I can trade up with a lot of my unit style of deck, well, And sometimes you can kind of just get cheesed out by a lot of different strategies, right? Like the Django red, or in general space strategy, can kind of just run you over because you don't have anything to deal with it. Or in Han Yellow's case, it's really rough because you could never deploy Anakin because of the tech DJ combo. Or let's say you deploy Anakin, but then your opponent's playing Quinlan red and just one-shots your Anakin when he comes down with Plo Koon, and then follows up with a force throw or something crazy like that. There are just so many different options to deal with Anakin, as well as just kind of outvaluing this mid-range strategy, that I'm not surprised after the fact, seeing the rest of the decks, to see Anakin below what we had expected. Definitely underperforming, but not too surprising considering what we are seeing in the top 8. A few other lists that I figured were worth mentioning. OG Han Green. This is kind of a variation. Still playing the Tech DJ combo. Still excellent. Kira Green, the Villainy Control Shell with Command. Always pretty solid. We have Palp Yellow. A lot of people really like this list. It's kind of a pet favorite for a lot of people. Ray Red. This is a very much similar deck to Anakin Blue, and except Ray Red gives you access to Tarkin Town, which is pretty nice. Boss Green, no ECL. A little bit surprised with the no ECL. We're going to be going over a few lists that I chose as we have them on the site here that we can talk about, and one of them is that Boss Green list. We'll talk more about that later. Krennic ECL, pretty sweet. Double Blue Iden, of course, Fennec Red, that's in here, and a bunch of one-ofs, including like an Asajj Red, which is pretty sweet. We've got Double Green Palp, which is pretty sweet, and some weird ones like Django Blues or CAD Bane Blues, or just a bunch of random ones. We even have a Django Red no Tarkin Town popping up, which I'm a little bit intrigued by that. We have a Hondo Yellow popping up in the meta. And again, I want to mention this because this is really important to understand. When we were talking about set 2 planetary qualifiers, it was almost like Boba Fett forced people to play better decks, and you couldn't actually take a slot with some random deck. With the ban, there's not this exceptionally dominant deck, so much so that you're not seeing these random decks. Like, I don't think Hondo Yellow is a particularly amazing deck either. It's decent, apparently, right? Based on what we're seeing here. But we are not seeing like this dominant performance from Hondo Yellow where it's coming in droves and is absolutely crushing every deck that we're seeing. But that same thing goes with things like, you know, the CAD Bane Blues, or the Django ECLs, or the Quinlan ECLs, right? We're not seeing a ton of people play these, but the people that are can have the ability, if you are a good enough player, to enter into the top 8 because of the way the meta is. And I think this is more indicative of just the balance of the game than it is these decks are so good or so bad or whatnot, or a leader's so good or so bad, which is really, really cool. With that said, let's talk about some specific lists that I have that I pulled out because we have the deck lists on the competitive site. So let me just move myself over. First up, we got Boss Green, which is one of my favorite decks to play in general, but I generally lean towards Boss ECL simply because the ability to go ahead and do things like immediately claim your price on your heads or Bounty Hunter's Quarry with ECL is pretty nice. However, this might be an adaptation due to how many space decks are running out there. A lot of the times you're not playing nearly as many space units in your deck with Bosk, and so ECL gets a lot weaker due to that, and you get the 5 extra HP, which can go ahead and compete with those space decks a little bit better. But as per usual with Villainy Command and playing a little bit of ramp, you've got your full 3 of Darth Vaders, full 3 of Mauls, the Emperor Palpatines, Reinforcement Walkers, and Crate Dragons as your top end, and then a bunch of things to get you there, really. Like a bunch of things just to get you there. We're playing, or this person's playing a little bit of removal. We've got 3 of Resupplies, we got the price on your heads, and we've got the Super Laser Technician, so 9 ramp events / units / upgrades. We have the Bounty Hunter's Quarry, which is an exceptional card for Boss Green. This is one of those cards where I think it makes Boss Green. Like if you didn't have Bounty Hunter's Quarry, this deck would be not nearly as good. Of course, Overwhelming Barrage as we're used to, but this is a pretty standard Boss Green list. It's just a matter of using the 30 HP base over the ECL, and I think that does make a decent difference, especially when you're competing against a lot of space decks out there. The next list that we got to talk about is this Asajj red deck. There's not a lot of decks on the site right now because the planetary qualifier results are just coming in. Of course, we have the classics like Han Yellow and Sabine Green, which are not super interesting to talk about. So I just decided to pull some ones that are a little bit less prominent. And well, Asajj red, it is awesome to see here. We've got a very, very interesting list where we are going into space, but we are very, very aggressive, getting down early game units like Bazine to mess with your opponent's hand, which is a little bit surprising because I wouldn't have expected Bazine in the deck. But we've got like Snowtrooper Lieutenant, so things like, well, your Lurking TIE Phantom or 7th Fleet Defender or even TIE Advanced or Ruthless Raider all can go ahead and hit for an extra 2 damage. It doesn't work specifically with Asajj. We've got the ATSTs to work with Triple Dark Raid, but I think this is more of using the Triple Dark Raid plus the Asajj action to just get in more damage for the space arena. And then because Asajj deploys so quickly, you can kind of look at her as a 4 damage burn event. That's kind of how this works. I think one of the coolest things about this deck is that we are playing Savage, which is interesting because later on in the game, because you're triple dark raiding and bouncing things back to your hand and you're not going to have ground units, your opponent's probably going to have their leader on the board. Savage is probably going to be able to ready a good amount of time, which is actually really awesome to see. So really interesting deck. I don't know how tuned this is. I don't know if people are really like pushing Asajj red or if it was just like, hey, I'm going to bring my Asajj red deck, but it's really awesome to see regardless. And then the next one we've got CAD Bane Blue, which I imagine Django Blue is quite similar to this, but it's not quite a control deck. It's more of like this soft control / more mid-rangey deck. There are removal events, things like Power the Dark Side, Fell the Dragon, Takedown, you got Vigilance, you even have a copy of Super Laser Blast, and you got Perilous Positions, but you're playing a ton of units. This deck's got the Cartel Spacers, the Elite P-38s, the Avengers to close out the game. We're also got a lot of early game, Crafty Smugglers, Pike Sentinels, Bobas, Forloms and Zuckeye. We've got Lum Pike and Bosks to help clear the board, just playing a bunch of Underworld cards. And the idea behind this, I imagine, is you're just getting a lot of value, right? You're removing your opponent's units, you're playing your units, and you're just pinging them down with CAD Bane, right? Pretty standard stuff, nothing too crazy here. And just another option to go ahead and play. Again, I imagine Django Blue is going to be very similar to this style, where you're not playing like a hard control deck, because if you are, you probably want to be going to the Bosk Blue direction, but you do get to play things like Elite P-38, which is just a good unit, and it goes ahead and exhausts things, right? And that's just really strong as someone, if you are playing a more controlling deck, to get to the late game. If you're able to stall out your opponent without costing additional resources and able to deploy things to the board, that's a really nice combination. Unlike things like Thrawn, which we've seen Thrawn Blue in the past, Thrawn has to cost you another resource to exhaust things, on top of, you kind of want to deploy to the board, and you have a little bit of leader flip, and you don't really get anything else outside of that. CAD Bane and your Djangos each provide something a little bit more. CAD Bane in just dealing these random damage that actually helps you kind of make things like Pike Sentinel trade into 3 toughness units, or just getting rid of units with this damage ping, and then Django to exhaust units, which is really cool. So makes a lot of sense why we're seeing CAD Bane and Django. But again, these aren't like particularly strong decks. Like if I were to look at this and I were to fight against it, which I have played against some Django Blues and some CAD Bane Blues, not directly the same list, but very similar in style. I've even played them myself. These aren't like SS tier decks. Again, the S tier decks are these ones up here, like these top 6, really, the ones that are really performing well. These one-ofs are not crazy lists. They are just people playing what they want, and they played well. Again, Iden Yellow, Hondo Yellow, CAD Bane Blue, Asajj Red. It's crazy to see. And that is awesome to see. I'm really excited. And this just makes me more excited about kind of the rest of the planetary qualifiers, because it's going to make each one a little bit more fun to watch. We might see some random stuff. If you had paid attention and watched a lot of the planetary qualifiers from set 2, which I know a lot of my patrons did, I know a lot of people kind of in the community that did, it was almost always like, okay, here's a boss green versus boba green versus boba green, and then boba green versus Sabine green, and then boba green versus Han yellow, and then boba blue versus boba red, and then boba red versus Sabine green. Like, it was all boba 40% of the time, and even more so as we got closer to the top 4, top 2. And then there was a sprinkling of Sabine greens and like Han yellows and array reds and that type of stuff. This is significantly different. And again, we only have 11 total planetary qualifiers to talk about. I can't wait to see the rest of them. And I absolutely love this tool from the competitive hub, because previously I was doing spreadsheets and marking down all the results myself. This just gives you a really easy way to look at it. One last thing I wanted to mention was Tarkin Town. It has solidified itself as the, well, most likely strongest base, but at least the most popular base in terms of Star Wars Limited right now. And this is probably due to a shift in what decks are being played and more of the color of the options that you're playing. ECL does have oftentimes like massively game-changing effects. When you're playing Quinlan, or you're playing CAD Bane, or you're playing Django, the red pairing fits so much better that Tarkin Town is the option. Of course, ECL is the base that's played in the most winning deck, but Tarkin Town is, at least in terms of the meta overall, the strongest base that we've got right now. And I really hope to see some really interesting bases with these over 30 HP bases from set 4, because right now the bases that we've gotten not making an impact at all. Again, the only base I figure could make an impact would be Petronaki Arena, and the decks that I would figure be playing it, Han Yellow, maybe like the Cassian Yellow, or maybe like the Sabine Yellow, all are not. And that's mainly because they need the HP to deal with Django's, Quinlan's, Sabine's, because extra 5 HP doesn't actually make up, or the extra 1 power on your leader doesn't make up for the 5 HP loss, because usually you're only getting 2 to 3 attacks in with a leader at kind of average to above average scenarios. And in most cases, if you're playing, a later leader, you can sometimes only get like 1 attack in. And so that's 1 damage or 2 damage or 3 damage versus 5 HP against your opponents. And so that's most likely, or a 4 HP rather, with Petronaki Arena that you're not getting, which makes a lot of sense, right? Of course, if you're playing against like Boss Blue, then you'd rather have Petronaki Arena, but it's more of a meta choice than a specific deck countering choice, right? You got to play for the most matchups rather than one specific matchup, usually when you're building a deck for a competitive event. With that said, let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Let me know if you're kind of in the same area that I am, which is I'm excited to see it. I think this is a really cool indication of where we're headed as a meta. And when we talk about the meta decks, there's definitely not as massive of a drop off between the meta decks and then the, well, semi-meta decks, and then the kind of showdown was what I would call them, the showdown decks, like the F&M decks or the Friday Night Star Wars decks. There's not nearly as big of a drop off, which is cool to see. And I'll see you all for the next one.